Hi, welcome to the third of Newman's videos on Catholic social teaching. This one is entitled Rights and Responsibilities. It's an interesting topic in and of itself. As a historian, I'm forced to admit that for much of the church's history, it really did operate under the notion that error has no rights, and therefore the church could impose its own vision on peoples, and sometimes do this by coercion and sometimes do this by force. And it's really not until the 20th century, and particularly, again, the Second Vatican Council, where the church foursquare comes down on the side of basic inalienable human rights. And it actually articulates this quite a bit after the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. Now, why is this the case? The church increasingly recognizes that human society is tremendously interdependent and intertwined. There are all kinds of networks of goods and labor and transmigration of peoples and all kinds of interchanges. This is even before the whole question of internet and the creation of a worldwide community in that way. The church also recognizes that there's tremendous inequality both within societies and between certain societies and other societies. And therefore, the church has felt the need to talk about human rights as being something that is universal, something that is inviolable, that is, this is basic, inalienable, belonging to human beings as the right of human beings. Additionally, this has to be viewed as a whole. So this is all of humanity possesses this, not just privileged individuals. Now, the classic question of rights is articulated in church teaching in John Paul II's document Centesimus Annus. That means the 100th anniversary, and the 100th anniversary would be the 100th anniversary of none other than Rerum Novarum, which is the basis of all of Catholic social teaching, and it was dated 1991 but issued in 1992. And John Paul lists 6 inalienable human rights. The first is the basic right to life. Everything else flows from this preeminent right. And this right to life underlines the typical Catholic optimistic view that all human life has potential. And it does not matter whether that potential is born in poverty. It does not matter whether that potential is born as the 12th child of an impoverished family. It does not matter whether that life is marked by illness. All human life has potential, and the right to life is an inalienable right as human beings. The second is the right for any of us to live in a family of our choosing and in a moral environment conducive to the growth of the development of a child's personality. That is, we should be living in healthy, stable family communities that no one has a right to separate, that no one has a right to dictate, that no one has a right to force in any way, shape, or form, but each individual human being has the right to form a family and raise children in an environment conducive to making them good, solid, adult human beings. Similarly, everyone has the right to develop his or her own intelligence and his or her own freedom and will. The growth in understanding, the growth in freedom, the growth in psychological maturity, and all the things that come with it are a basic human right that are open to everyone, again, not merely the rich and the privileged. Everyone has the right to share in work. which makes wise use of the earth's material resources. And that means that the church is always in favor, as we've said multiple times in these videos, of expanding economies such that more and more people find meaningful work that fits their personality, that allows them to be co-creators with God in the whole moral order, and allows them to sustain their families. And this is the second part of the very same principle, to derive from that work the means to support oneself and one's dependents. Here we come back to an idea that's well over 100 years old in Catholic social teaching, that is the living family wage. Here we're not talking about a federal minimum wage, but a living family wage that guarantees each worker enough sustenance from his or her labor to provide for self, to provide for family, to provide for adequate housing, to provide for pension and old age care, and to provide for access to health care, which Catholic social teaching always underlines is a human right, not a perquisite of having a white-collar job. These are very important principles that need to be re-underlined again. The right freely to establish a family, to have and to rear children. Again, there should be no state limiting legally means around things like family planning. Families should be free to exercise their own sexuality and their own families as well. And the final one that the church always comes to is the right to religious freedom. That is, the right to follow one's conscience and the right to follow what one's understanding of transcendence or God's moral values are, without any kind of coercion of conscience or without any kind of coercion of individual thinking about these things. And this, by the way, is one of the fundamental pieces that comes out of the Second Vatican Council that is, frankly speaking, a marked change and development and growth from the past, when again, particularly around the questions of religious liberty, the church was rather strong that error has no rights. Now, this is the rights end of things. Rights always presuppose responsibilities. That is, I cannot claim to have rights on the one hand and at the same time refuse to do my responsibilities and the duties, because essentially what I'm doing then is building with one hand and ripping down with the other. So rights and responsibilities always go together. We live in an age and a time that is much more comfortable speaking about rights than it is about speaking about responsibilities. We're much more comfortable in asserting our own human individual rights and much less comfortable and much less willing to assume the responsibilities that go with it. Now, this level of Catholic teaching goes for individuals as well as for communities. That is, individuals and communities have rights, and connected to those rights are responsibilities. Now, essentially, what always needs to get done with this, the basic responsibility that we all have is to work for the common good, period. To work for the common good, no matter in what way, shape, or form that might be. Things that we've talked about, family, community, political engagement, civic engagement, just simply connecting with other people, everything that we need to do in the social sphere that promotes the common good and promotes some good of other people as well as ourselves. Now, the church is also clear that those of us who are more fortunate in terms of economic goods should willingly renounce some of our rights, such as the absolute right to private property, so as to place our goods more generously at the service of others. That is a responsibility that we have. At the same time, those who are less economically well off, those who are more needy in terms of the world goods, should not overly stress the whole question of an excessive affirmation of equality. That is, that everybody should be exactly the same, because that gives rise to an individualism where everyone is essentially looking around tit for tat, making sure everybody gets exactly the same thing, much like you might have had to do with your toddlers to make sure that somebody didn't get 6 Cheerios more than his or her sibling. So there is this question of giving up some rights for other people, but that's not, again, an absolute thing. Notice how we're always threading the middle of this. My novice master always told us that virtus stat in medio. Virtue goes right down the middle. And this is where Catholic social teaching often finds itself. Now, what's the role of the church in doing all of these things? First, proclaim the Christian foundation of human rights. That's what we do. We stand up for human rights, period. And that also means, at times, denouncing their violations. Once again, this gets us into the difficult area of how much can and should a church tread into political territory. But again, the church does have the absolute responsibility to denounce any infringement upon human rights. And it calls upon people to promote their own level of responsibility to care for the common good, and most particularly to put into practice practical church teaching, such as the corporal works of mercy and such as the spiritual works of mercy. This is always our responsibility, and our responsibility is always connected to our rights. Thanks for listening.